Good evening, Minister. As Ireland emerges from the crisis, we're going to need our arts community more than ever. When the time comes that we can gather in groups with our friends or with our families, it will be our artists, through their music, through their drama, through their artistic content, who will be the focal point of that much needed and much longed for gathering. We are going to rely on our artists to help us laugh again. Undoubtedly, when the time comes that we can honour and pay homage to our frontline workers and those who have served us during this time of great need, our retail staff, our cleaners, our nurses, our doctors, it's going to be our artists who help us fulfil that function. And probably most importantly of all, it's going to be our artists who help us grieve. Our artists will help us find the manner in which to find expression for grief for those we've lost or for the lost time away from those we've longed to hold. Our artists will meet this challenge. We know this because they always have. For every occasion that difficulty has befallen this country, our artists have been there to help formulate our understanding of what is happening. Through the economic dreariness of the 80s and the early 90s, it was the artists that brought life to the voids, quite literally in some sense. It was the artists who enlivened those spaces. They brought music. In my own constituency, I'm thinking about the SFX, I'm thinking about the Temple Theatre. It was the artists during those dreary times who gave a generation of Irish people a reason to stay here when no other reason really existed. Through the decadence of the Celtic Tiger, it was our artists who brought much needed ridicule. Ridicule on a nation that was getting ahead of herself, ridicule on the politicians in this chamber who were getting ahead of ourselves. And it was the artists who helped us find meaning. And when the crash inevitably came, when all else deserted us, it was our artists who propped us up. It were our artists again who helped us to find meaning in what it really meant to be Irish, to stand in substance rather than in what we'd given over to artificial content during the Celtic Tiger. And then when the pandemic hit us, and the pandemic has been a time when so many people have stepped forward, it'll be our artists who once again help us find meaning. And I'm confident in the role the arts will play there in the weeks and the months to follow, because they have done that time and time again. And throughout that process, we've talked about how great our artists are. We've built statues to the exceptional artists. We had gatherings to bring people home, and we used their music of our artists to kind of share meaning and to summon people back. But when this pandemic struck in March, what this state and this government offered to our artists was 0.11% of our GDP. That's less than half of the European average. And when we talk about the role that our arts play, when you actually give over with what that means, in essence, you can't put our nice words on the bread. And our artists have suffered for long enough, even though we need them. We constantly need them. They constantly prop us up. And that's something that we have to change. Minister, I want to ask you a question, firstly, about the process for reopening. You've mentioned that Phase 4 galleries can reopen, and in Phase 5 we'll see theatres reopening. You've talked about NEFE have given those guidelines, but I actually think we need something much stronger than that. Minister, do you have guidelines for how that reopening would happen? I think you mentioned to my colleague from Dublin West that the Draoch Theatre, for example, would have to develop their own guidelines, but I don't think that's appropriate. Will there be guidelines regarding physical distancing? I'm thinking about even the Abbey Theatre, for example. I've seen one estimate yesterday that if the Abbey Theatre were to reopen under social distancing guidelines, we could get 43 people in there. That's not going to be accessible. So, Minister, what are the guidelines for reopening? When will we see them?
We have the roadmap, as you know, already in terms of the 5 different phases, and all things being equal, and depending on the advice from NENFIT, which the government will take into account, we will proceed to each phase consecutively. But obviously, some of those phases may well be accelerated if things go better, and they may regress if things don't go as well. So, you know, in terms of, I'm not sure it's a specific art centre you're talking about, or just in general in terms of the national cultural institutions. There's a huge amount, Deputy, just to reassure you, there's a huge amount of engagement from my department from the Arts Council as well, first of all, to their arts organisations, but from my department, primarily with the national cultural institutions and other arts organisations in terms of how they're going to reopen. And obviously, you know, they're working themselves in terms of proposals and delivering on those. So we're in constant contact with them, you know, in terms of, but I do understand the challenges that exist.
In terms of the actual guidelines of what the state and FF, they're a medical organisation, in terms of state managers and guidelines about how theatres can actually
Well, we have
open.
the return to work safety protocol, you know, which is separate to public health, and that clearly sets out measures that need to be taken into account, and these are guidelines for working environments. And at the end of the day, all of these national culture institutions and all of these spaces, they are working environments as well. So we have to ensure, and you know, we have to ensure that the audiences are safe as well as the people that are working there. So just to reassure you, Deputy, we're taking all of those factors into account, and my department is working extremely hard, and all the senior officials, in engaging with every single type of arts organisation in the country in relation to that.
Thank you, Minister. I do feel that we need some sort of physical guidelines for how theatres can open. That is given from the department, however. I just want to move on to talk about the artist payments. We've accepted now that €203 unemployment benefit is not enough for a person to live off. I mean, we've crossed that Rubicon already. So as we return to work, and artists, let's face it, not only artists, but the freelance technicians that are associated with artists, 23,000 people, according to the Census in 2016, make their living from art. These are going to be some of the last groups of people to come back to normality. And yet there will be an expectation for them to live off €203 when the COVID payment subsides. So, Minister, just could you clarify, or even suggest, even in your own opinion as Minister for Arts, can we extend the COVID payment for artists? What's the process for which we can make that happen? Because so many won't be able to live off €203 and so many others won't be able to apply for the Facebook grant. And the fact that we've said that there was oversubscribed for this arts bursary is not because the bursary itself was so great, it was because the need was greater. Artists understand what it means to be hungry, and they're terrified about what happens when the payment subsides.
Well, to say, as I outlined earlier on, there are about 14,000 of this particular sector availing of the COVID-19 pandemic unemployment payment. But I mean, it cannot continue indefinitely. And that was never intended, because maintaining it would actually be divisive, and it would create two different forms of unemployment payment. So, and we don't think that's fair or sustainable in the long term. So, you know, ultimately it'll have to be reformed by a new government coming in. But, you know, I think it's important to say, and there have been some comparisons with the UK and with Germany. I haven't had the opportunity, Count Cora, to answer many of the questions that have been raised by many deputies here, and I don't want that narrative to get out, because actually it's very misleading. I mean, particularly when you're looking at Germany, for example, and the 50 billion there, the reality is that this is a package for all self-employed people and micro-enterprises, and Ireland has similar packages for businesses as well. You know, the COVID-19 payment is important, and it is an absolute lifeline for artists at the moment, and it will be tapered down at some point in the near future. You know, and in terms of the UK as well, this money comes from the reallocation of monies. So, you know, it's not monies going specifically to artists. You know, just because they put out a figure of a certain amount, it sounds a lot more appetising than it actually is in reality.
And so just as we reopen our artistic spaces, do you, the Department of Vision provide capital grants that will enable artistic spaces, particularly community spaces, which won't be able to fund many of the requirements that will be needed to enhance safe social distance measures?
Project 2040, which is for, you know, which is infrastructure. But, you know, in terms of grants, we have grants and schemes that are available in the department anyway. You know, I would hope that they would be continued, but we have to remember we're living in an environment at the moment where there's, you know, going to be a 30 billion deficit this year, and a projected, you know, that's just a projection at the moment, and 14 billion next year. So, you know, we have to have a bit of realism in terms of what we're going to be able to achieve. One thing that I never do is make a promise that I can't keep, and I'm not going to do that. Because, you know, obviously, I in particular have been fighting as hard as I can for this sector, and I will continue to do that for as long as I am in this role, and I hope that the next minister will do the same, and every minister does it for their sector. But you know, there are competing priorities, and obviously public health is the overriding one. But you know, I take on board everything you're saying. I mean, we have 1.1 million people availing of social welfare benefits in this country alone at the moment. But you know, certainly I would hope, you know, is all I can say to you now at the moment, that they will continue.
Deputy Boyd Barrett.